What if I told you that Iran, yes, the modern nation of Iran, is not a footnote in the Bible but a central character? Not merely a backdrop for empires to rise and fall, but a nation named, called, used, woven into prophecy as an agent of God's will. You've heard of Egypt, you've heard of Babylon, but Persia was chosen. To understand how we return to the beginning. After the flood, as the waters fled and dry land emerged, three men stepped into the silence of a new world, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, sons of Noah. They carried in their blood the future of nations. And from Japheth came a son named Madai's descendants. The Medes traveled east to the land of rising sun and rugged hills. They were not kings, they raised sheep, they carved altars from stone. But the ground they walked would one day hold palaces, and the hills they wandered would echo with decrees of deliverance. The Medes became neighbors to another tribe, the Persians. From shared soil, a shared destiny emerged. The two peoples intertwined slowly over generations until a new force stirred in the region, the Medo-Persian Empire. But long before the conquest, before Babylon fell, before the temple was rebuilt, there lived a man named Davasar. He was no priest, no prophet of Israel, no man of the covenant. He was a son of the Medes, quiet, watchful, burdened with dreams. The visions began when he was still young. He saw fires consuming idols, a city of stone weeping in exile, a temple rising again by the hands of strangers, and a name, Yisrael, spoken in a tongue not his own, yet burning in his soul. A voice came in the night. Write, Davasar. Record what you see, for though your hands are foreign, your witness is chosen. He obeyed. He pressed script into clay tablets. He buried them in earthen jars. He whispered words he did not understand. And in the stillness, he believed that his people, outsiders, would one day become instruments of prophecy, that Persia, though pagan, would stand under heaven's gaze, and that the God of Israel was already walking the mountains of his homeland. This is where our story begins, not in Jerusalem, but in the hills of ancient Iran. Davasar wrote in secret, by oil lamp, by the hush of midnight winds. He carved his visions onto clay rows of curling script that no Hebrew would ever read, yet heaven did not forget. Heaven did. In his scrolls there were no names of kings, not yet. No dates, only images. A lion devouring a man. A tree whose roots drank fire, a silver river that broke the neck of a golden beast. And in the center always a people in chains, their songs turned to dust, and a city burning in the west. He did not know that city. He did not know its people, but he wept for them. They are not yours, the voice told him, but their God is also the God of mountains. He did not understand. Still he listened. In the valleys of Media and the highlands of Elam, the Medes began to grow. They formed alliances, they conquered cities, they whispered of kings. The Persians, their cousins by blood and fate, rose beside them, fierce, ambitious, and tireless. Where the Medes built with caution, the Persians moved with fire. And as Davasar grew older, he saw what he had written begin to take shape. A chieftain named Cyrus was born among the Persians. Even as a child, he moved like thunder through the villages. By his 20th year, he had united tribes. By 30, he had broken Median rule, but did not destroy it. Instead, Cyrus did something no other warlord had done. He honored the Medes. He merged their strength into his own. And so the Medo-Persian Empire was born not in hatred, but in fusion, not by blood alone, but by vision. Davasar, now old and bent, stood at the edge of a market road and watched banners rise. He felt the stir. He heard the name Cyrus on every tongue. And that night, in a final dream, the voice returned. He is the one. The river has begun to flow. Davasar wept. He gathered his scrolls. He placed them in a sealed urn, and he buried them beneath a hill of almond trees where caravans would one day pass. No one saw him. No one remembered. But prophecy does not need applause. It only needs obedience. Years passed like dust on stone. Davasar was gone, his name spoken only in the hushed tones of old men who remembered dreams. But dreams do not die. They are carried forward by time and by kings. Cyrus, son of Persia, had become more than a warlord. He was a ruler of nations. Under his banner, cities bowed. From the Indus to the Aegean, his empire grew not through terror, but through vision. And though he did not worship the God of Israel, that God had already spoken his name. Over 100 years before Cyrus took Babylon, a prophet in Judah had written, "This is what the Lord says of Cyrus, my shepherd who shall fulfill all my purpose," Isaiah 44:28. "And again I summon you by name, though you do not acknowledge me." Isaiah 45:4. How could this be? A pagan king, a foreigner. A son of fire and stone called shepherd, anointed chosen. It defied all expectation, but not God's design. When Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BC, he found himself in possession of a broken people. Israelites scattered and weary, longing for a home they feared forgotten. He did not enslave them. He did not silence their songs. Instead, he listened. A scroll was brought to him, perhaps by Daniel, perhaps by another faithful exile. On it were words written a century before his birth, his own name, his destiny. And something stirred in him, not religion perhaps, but reverence. Soon after, a decree rang through the empire. "The God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a house for him at Jerusalem." Ezra 1:2. The captives were free. The temple would rise again. And Persia, land of Davasar, land of shepherds and stars, had become the hand of God. Not by accident, not by chance, but by prophecy, by purpose. And the world would never be the same. Subscribe to Verse and Wisdom to follow the sacred unfolding of Persia's hidden role in divine history. But if Cyrus, a pagan king, could carry the will of the Almighty, what else had the world misunderstood about power, about purpose? Could a kingdom forged by foreign gods still become a vessel of the true God? As the Israelites returned from exile, as stones were lifted and altars rebuilt, Persia did not retreat into the shadows. No. It stepped forward, with laws, with gold, with protection, but also with danger. For not all in the empire rejoiced at Israel's return, and not all hands that bore the seal of the king sought the peace of Zion. They returned in silence, not with trumpets, not with armies, but with carts, children old songs half remembered, and scrolls too holy to speak aloud. The exiles of Zion came home beneath the shadow of Persian banners. They walked the old roads past broken wells and empty fields toward a city that had forgotten how to stand. Jerusalem. It was not a city. It was a graveyard of stone. Ashes where the altar once burned, ruins where the priests once sang. And yet, within this wreckage, a remnant remembered. They began to rebuild. With trembling hands, with borrowed tools, and with permission stamped and sealed by a foreign king named Cyrus. The irony hung in the air like incense. That Israel, the covenant people, had been restored by Persia, a nation of fire worshippers. That the God who had once thundered from Sinai now spoke through decrees in Aramaic. But prophecy never bends to comfort. It stretches. It surprises. And Cyrus, though he did not know it, was answering a voice older than kings. A voice that had once said, "I will bring them back. I will plant them, and no one shall uproot them again." Yet even as the foundation stones were laid, the enemies of restoration stirred. Samaritans, old adversaries, men of the land who had prospered in Judah's absence, who now looked with cold eyes upon the returning exiles. They wrote letters to Persia. They whispered of rebellion. They twisted truth into threat. And the empire listened. Cyrus was gone. Other kings reigned less generous, more distant. Construction halted. Hope dimmed. The songs faded again. Where was the God who had opened the gates of Babylon? Where was the power that had named a pagan king? It seemed once more that the remnant had been forgotten. But in Susa, the capital of Persia, in the silent halls of royal intrigue, God was writing a different chapter. One not in stone, but in blood. In Susa, the winter palace gleamed with ivory and firelight. Silks rustled down marbled corridors. Incense curled in golden bowls, and behind latticed walls decisions were made that shaped the fate of nations. There sat kings, there moved princes. But it was the whispers that ruled. Court officials from every province came bearing scrolls, tributes, rumors, suspicions. And among them, older, now cloaked in the plain robes of a court recorder, walked Davasar. His name had long faded from the hills. No one remembered the almond trees. No one asked about the buried scrolls. But he remembered. He saw the letters condemning the Jews. He heard the muttering of governors, too many of them rebuilding walls, preparing rebellion. He said nothing. But at night he prayed not to Ahura Mazda, nor to the gods of fire, but to the voice he had once heard in the mountains. Let not the word you spoke return void. And then a tremor, a new face in the palace. A Jewish man, wary-eyed, dignified, who served as a minor advisor. His name, Mordecai. He was no prophet, he was no soldier. But Davasar watched him carefully. There was something in his posture, something old. And one day Mordecai brought with him a young girl, a ward, an orphan. She walked like someone who had learned silence from sorrow. But her eyes, they held fire. Her name was Hadassah. The Persians would call her Esther. Davasar felt it. Not a vision, not a voice, but the shiver of prophecy waking again. He returned home that night, opened a hidden drawer, and unfolded one of his last tablets. On it, a simple engraving barely legible through time, for such a time as this. He had carved it decades before, not knowing when, not knowing why. But now, in the golden halls of Persia, with exiles scattered and enemies gathering, the meaning was beginning to rise, like dawn behind mountains. The king was restless. His name was Xerxes, known to the Hebrews as Ahasuerus, a ruler of extravagance, of mood, of unchecked power. And, in a drunken fury, he dismissed his queen. Vashti was gone. The throne beside him sat empty. And the empire, hungry for spectacle, called for a search. From across the provinces, maidens were gathered. They were bathed in oils, cloaked in perfume, stripped of language and past. Jewels were pressed into their hands, but silence was pressed into their souls. Among them, Esther. She said nothing of her people, nothing of her God. She moved through this palace like mist, soft, unnoticed, obedient. And the king chose her. He crowned her queen, a Jewish orphan now adorned in Persian gold. But crowns do not protect from storms. They only catch the lightning. In the corridors beyond the throne, danger slithered. A man named Haman had risen, a descendant of Agag, an old enemy of Israel. He bowed to no god but power. And when Mordecai refused to kneel, Haman's pride turned venomous. He did not seek justice. He sought genocide. With cunning words and sealed letters, he convinced Xerxes to sign a decree. All Jews on a chosen day were to be killed. From Susa to Samaria, from Babylon to Bethlehem. Every man, every woman, every child. The date was cast. The law was sealed. Panic spread like fire through the Jewish quarter. Sackcloth appeared on doorways, ash on foreheads, wails in the night. But in the palace behind veils of luxury, Esther sat unaware, until Mordecai sent word. He did not beg, he did not flatter. He wrote, "If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." And somewhere in the palace Davasar heard, not the message, not the words, but the echo. The same phrase, the same tablet, the same shiver. The voice he once knew had not forgotten. The scroll was unrolling again, and all of Persia was holding its breath. But what does a single voice matter against an empire? What can a hidden orphan do when the law has already spoken death? And yet, it is often in the silence before the blow, in the stillness of prayer, in the trembling of resolve, that the heavens prepare their reply. She stood alone, but she would not remain silent. For when a daughter of Zion dares to speak before the throne of kings, all of history leans in to listen. Esther fasted. For 3 days she touched no bread, no wine. Her servants did the same. In every hidden corner of the palace, whispers turned to silence. In every house of the exiles, lamps burned low and prayers rose like smoke. Death had been declared, but hope had not surrendered. On the 3rd day she rose. She did not dress as a supplicant. She did not clothe herself in mourning. She wore the royal robes, the crown, the glory of Persia. And yet beneath the jewels, her heart beat like thunder. For to enter the king's presence unbidden was death by law, by tradition, by decree. Unless he extended the golden scepter. She walked the corridor of judgment past gilded columns and armed guards. Each step was a prayer, each breath a covenant with courage. And then she stood before the throne. Xerxes looked up, his gaze sharp, unreadable. The chamber held its breath. Then he lifted the scepter, not because he understood, not because he believed, but because God had moved his hand. "Speak," he said. Esther bowed. Her voice was soft but steady. "I wish only to prepare a banquet for the king and for Haman." It was a trap, not of deception but of timing, not for vengeance but for revelation. For truth needs space to breathe, and courage must bloom in silence before it can thunder. That night, as the feast was prepared, Haman rejoiced. He was honored, he was powerful, he was invited by the queen. But outside the palace he saw Mordecai once more, still unbowed, still defiant. And pride, that ancient serpent, curled tighter around his soul. He ordered a gallows built high and cruel, 75 feet into the sky. For in his heart the feast was not a gift. It was a beginning of his revenge. Yet he did not know that the very rope he was weaving was for his own neck. That night the king could not sleep, not because of guilt, not because of dread, but because heaven had chosen that silence to stir his spirit. He tossed on silk sheets, he paced beneath frescoed ceilings, and at last he summoned the scribes. "Read to me," he commanded, "from the book of records, page after page, deeds of governors, wars, treaties, taxes, and then a name, Mordecai, the Jew who had once uncovered a plot to kill the king but had never been honored." The king stopped the reading, his voice sharpened. "What has been done for him?" "Nothing," they replied. At dawn, Haman entered, smiling, eager to request the death of Mordecai. Before he could speak, the king asked, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Pride again whispered its lies. Haman imagined his own face on banners, his own name in cheers. And so he said, "Let him wear the king's robe, ride the king's horse, and be paraded through the city." The king nodded. "Do so at once for Mordecai the Jew." And Haman paraded his enemy through streets he had hoped to cleanse in blood. Shame wrapped him tighter than the royal robe he carried. Humiliation trailed him like dust. And still Esther waited. The second banquet began that evening. Wine was poured. The king reclined. "What is your request?" he asked again. Esther stood. She did not tremble. She did not falter. Her voice cut through the air like prophecy. "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, then grant me my life and the lives of my people, for we are sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." The king's eyes flared. Who would dare such a thing? She turned. The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. The silence cracked. Haman fell. The king rose. And in the shadows of the hall, unseen by all, an old man with clouded eyes stood still. Davasar. He had come only to observe, but now he remembered the vision. A serpent lifted high, then cut down by the breath of a girl crowned in gold. The scroll had spoken. The scroll had not lied. The king turned from the table. His face darkened, his breath short. Haman remained trembling no longer, the favored, no longer the feared. He fell at Esther's feet, but mercy had already passed him by. A servant spoke. "There stands a gallows 75 feet tall, built by Haman for Mordecai." The king nodded. "Hang him on it." And so the man who plotted death was consumed by his own pride. The wood he raised for judgment became his own sentence. Justice moved swiftly, but deliverance required more. The decree to kill the Jews still stood. In Persia, no royal law could be undone, only countered. And so the king turned to Esther, to Mordecai. "Write as you see fit," he said. "Let the truth rise." And so a second decree spread across the empire, not of fear, but of strength. On the appointed day, the Jews would stand. They would not flee. They would not die. They would fight, and heaven would fight with them. Throughout the provinces the day came, and it passed. Blood was spilled, but it was not the blood of the innocent. Esther wept. Mordecai rose in stature, and among the elders of Susa Davasar returned home. He opened the jar buried beneath almond trees. He unrolled the final scroll. There faded by time was the dream, a queen crowned in danger, a people surrounded, a serpent slain by truth. He closed his eyes and whispered, "It has come to pass, not by the strength of empires, not by swords or thrones, but by courage, by obedience, by a God who sees from afar and speaks through the mouths of exiles." In the years to come, the Jews would name the day Purim, a feast of reversal, a remembrance. But Davasar knew it was not merely their story. It was Persia's too. For in the quiet corridors of power, God had used a foreign crown to shelter his promise. And that truth was more enduring than gold. If this story opened your eyes, let your spirit remain open. Subscribe to Verse and Wisdom, where ancient echoes speak to the soul of today. Far from Susa, in the heart of Babylon's ruins, a man knelt beside an open window. His name was Daniel, prophet, exile, interpreter of dreams. He had walked among lions. He had seen kings fall like shadows at dawn. And he had written by firelight, by tears of kingdoms yet to come. In the stillness of his chamber, he saw them again. Visions. A statue, towering and terrible, its head of gold, Babylon already fallen. Its chest and arms of silver, a double kingdom, Media and Persia. Two peoples, two strengths, forged into one. In the dream, the silver did not shine like gold. It was colder, sharper, built not for beauty but endurance. Then another vision, a bear raised up on one side, lumbering, uneven, with 3 ribs in its mouth. It devoured nations. It conquered not with finesse, but with might. Daniel wrote in silence. He had lived to see Babylon fall. He had watched Cyrus march in without bloodshed. He had heard the decree that freed his people. But he knew Persia was not the end, only a chapter. For soon came the ram with 2 horns. Strong, charging west, north, south. None could stand against it. Until a goat appeared, swift, furious, with a single great horn. It struck the ram, shattered it, trampled it beneath fury. And the horn became Alexander. Greece, another empire, another age. But in Daniel's trembling hands, the scrolls burned with a different fire. A message not of politics, but of sovereignty. God raises up kings, and God brings them down. Persia was silver because it followed gold, but it was still chosen, still used, still part of the pattern. And though its name would fade from the coins of men, its echo would remain in prophecy. As Daniel closed the scroll, he looked east, toward the mountains, toward the land where Cyrus once walked, toward Persia, and whispered, "Your time is not yet finished." Years later, Daniel fasted by the Tigris River. He had seen empires rise. He had survived court's lions and exile. But now he sought something deeper. Not dreams, not symbols, but understanding. For 3 weeks he ate no rich food. He anointed no oil. He waited. And then a man appeared, clothed in linen, with a face like lightning, eyes like flaming torches, voice like the roar of many waters. Daniel collapsed. The figure lifted him trembling and spoke. From the first day you set your heart to understand, your words were heard, but I was delayed 21 days by the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Not a man, not a king, but a spiritual power, a force unseen, a ruler behind the ruler. Michael came to help me, the angel said. And now I have come to make you understand what will happen to your people in the latter days. Here Persia was more than an empire. It was a battlefield, not of swords but of spirits, not of cities but of destinies. The prince of Persia was not Cyrus. It was the dark intelligence behind the throne, the adversary working through human pride, through law, through compromise. But God had sent his messenger still, because Persia mattered. Not just in history, but in the heavens. In Daniel's vision, the ram with 2 horns, Media and Persia, charged westward. It conquered, it claimed. But then came the goat, faster than the wind, and Persia was crushed. Yet Daniel saw more. A horn rose from the goat, and from it a smaller one, bold, blasphemous, terrible. He saw altars defiled, truth thrown to the ground. Daily sacrifice stopped. And he cried out, "How long, O Lord?" A voice replied, "Until the evening and the morning, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed." It was more than history. It was a clock, it was a covenant. Daniel wept, not for Babylon, not for Persia, but for the people of God still caught between the horns of empire. When the visions ended, Daniel lay still, his strength drained, his breath shallow, his heart heavy with what he had seen. Not just beasts, not just empires, but the aching truth that every kingdom, every crown, every decree of man was passing mist. Even Persia, with its wealth and wisdom, its laws etched in stone and sealed with rings, would fall. And yet, in the fall there was still glory, for God had used Persia to free the captives, to rebuild the temple, to raise up Esther, to shield a remnant, to remind the world that he rules through whom he chooses. Daniel remembered the words spoken in the night: the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he wills. He thought of Cyrus, a shepherd called by name before birth. He thought of Mordecai, once a gatekeeper, now clothed in honor. He thought of Esther, an orphan, a queen, a deliverer. And far away in the hills of Media, perhaps an old man named Davasar sat with a fading scroll in his lap, a scroll of clay, a dream of fire, and whispered, "It is as he said." Because Persia, though foreign, had not been forgotten, though pagan had been chosen, though silver had shone with purpose, and though the horns of empire would rise and fall. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, one throne remained unshaken. One hand still turned the pages, and in that hand even Persia was holy. But what becomes of a nation after its visions fade, after its kings are buried, its walls turn to dust? Does it vanish from the story? Or does prophecy remember? Even in silence, even in shadow, can the ancient name Persia still echo in the final pages of divine history? When the end draws near, does Iran once more step onto the stage? The prophets saw far, farther than kings, farther than exiles, farther than even Daniel could name. They saw the end, the trembling of nations, the gathering of storms. And in the visions, Persia remained, not as Cyrus, not as Esther, but as a name among enemies. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet stood on a high place and saw a final war. "The word of the Lord came to me," he wrote. "Set your face against Gog of the land of Magog and against Persia, Cush and Put." Ezekiel 38:2-5. Persia, still named, still present, in the last battle, in the final shaking. A coalition of nations rising against Israel led by a mysterious figure, Gog, and joined by Persia. It is not a war of borders. It is not about oil or land or treaties. It is a war of spirit, a war of destiny. And Ezekiel saw fire. He saw the mountains quake. He saw armies consumed. He saw God himself intervene. I will execute judgment with plague and bloodshed. I will show my greatness and my holiness, and the nations will know that I am the Lord. Ezekiel 38:22-23. Why Persia? Why would the same land, once used to redeem now, stand with those who rise against Zion? The answer lies not in politics, not in alliances, but in the great arc of prophecy. Nations are not static. They rise, they fall, they choose. And even those once used for good can turn their face from the light. Modern-day Iran, ancient Persia, stands in a region trembling with tension. Its leaders speak in tones of defiance. Its name appears in headlines, but also in scripture. And the scrolls of Ezekiel whisper still that the final battles will not be merely between armies, but between purposes, between covenant and rebellion, between promise and pride. Iran walks the stage again, not as an empire of marble and gold, but as a nation of tension and fire. Its leaders speak of resistance. Its generals invoke ancient names. Its streets echo with chants not far from prophecy. And Israel, reborn resilient, stands once more at the center of the world's attention. Coincidence or divine choreography? For those who remember the scrolls, history is not a cycle. It is a story. A long, winding, painful story, but one with a beginning and an end. Daniel's visions, Ezekiel's oracles, Isaiah's declarations, all speak of nations, but more than that, they speak of hearts, of rulers lifted up, then brought low, of powers who serve God's will whether they know his name or not. Iran, the heir of ancient Persia, carries a deep spiritual weight. It once freed the people of God. It once protected the remnant. But in the days to come, it may rise again with darker intent. Yet even that is not the end of hope. Because Scripture does not speak only of judgment. It speaks of return, of redemption, of even enemies becoming friends. In that day, Israel will be the third, along with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing on the earth. The Lord will bless them, saying, "Blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, my handiwork, and Israel, my inheritance." Isaiah 19:24-25. Assyria. Egypt. Could Persia be next? Could a land of ancient fire one day bow to the true light? The question remains open. Because prophecy warns but never forces. Nations choose, leaders decide. Hearts either harden or return. And as the world watches, as tensions rise, as scrolls unfold, one question hangs above the mountains of Iran. Will you be a vessel or an adversary? The scroll is almost closed. Its pages carry blood and light, kings and shepherds, prophecies fulfilled, and those still waiting. Persia is no longer the empire of Cyrus, no longer the court of Esther. But its shadow stretches far through Daniel's dreams, through Ezekiel's warnings, into the trembling silence of our time. It is not merely about Iran. It is about all nations, all powers, all hearts. For if God could anoint a foreign king, if he could hide his purposes in palaces and place queens upon thrones for moments of salvation, then what is he doing now? Where is his voice today? Where is his anointing? Perhaps not in temples of stone, perhaps not in headlines, but in the hearts of those who still listen. Like Davasar, who waited, who watched, who believed even when his name was forgotten. Like Esther, who risked all when silence was safest. Like Daniel, who prayed when no answer came. So now the question is not for Persia, nor for Israel, nor for Babylon long turned to dust. It is for us. In an age of tension, of wars and rumors of wars, of prophecy and power, what scroll is heaven unrolling in our day? And when it opens, where will your name be found? History does not whisper without reason. Every name, every nation, every moment etched in the scroll speaks. Persia, Cyrus, Esther, Iran. They are not just chapters in a forgotten book. They are mirrors. For kingdoms rise and fall, but the hand that writes their stories never falters. So, if something in this tale stirred your spirit, a memory you didn't know you carried, a question you've never dared to ask, then dwell with us a little longer. There are more scrolls, more voices, more truths waiting to unfold. This is Verse and Wisdom, where ancient light speaks into modern shadows. Subscribe not just with your finger, but with your heart. Until the next unveiling, Shalom.